Right. Hello, I'm Kaylee Salisbury. I teach chemistry at Southeast Polk.
Becky Wellman-Swartz. I also teach chemistry at Southeast Polk.
And we are going to share a phenomenon that we used for a unit on energy and matter, and it was called the Joules. So we're going to kind of just go through, if you see on the screen, just some of the resources that are linked here, kind of an overview, and then kind of how we use this to guide our unit. So first off, we have a link to the Joules video. This, I guess, what Joules are they're these little coffee bean shaped, pieces of metal that you put in your coffee, and it cools your coffee down to be the ideal drinking temperature. And then when your coffee cools, then they release that energy back in, and it's supposed to keep your coffee the ideal drinking temperature for a longer period of time.
And the way that we found this is I was working through with our science coach here at Southeast Polk, and her and I were looking at the standard and looking at the DCIs and thinking about, okay, what questions would we want kids to ask? Because what do they need to find out in this unit about? And so her and I talked through that process, and the link to that process is linked there, the Iowa Science Coaching Network. So if you want to view how we got to that, to the Joules, and it's right there for you.
Yeah, because coming up with the phenomenon it didn't just spring on us one day. But that was kind of, we showed that video. It was really short. It was like 2 minutes to our classes. And then we each went through a QFT process, which I linked that PowerPoint. So the question formulation technique is just kind of a technique to get kids to think about a focus question, which in this case it was, or the question, I guess what they were asking their questions on. It was Joules keep coffee the perfect drinkable temperature. So then they have to generate as many questions as they can about that question focus. And then the whole PowerPoint goes through them prioritizing their questions. And at the end of the whole thing, they come up with their top 3 questions. And then those were kind of what we used to put together our driving question boards. Like Becky said, we were kind of hoping for some of their questions. So I put my questions, I had kids go onto the Padlet, and they just posted their questions onto this wall. If you notice, they're color coded, because then we just went through as a group and said, okay, all of these questions in red were ones that had to do with temperature. So that worked out, because one of the content pieces that we wanted kids to figure out was, how do things change temperature? How is it related to energy and energy transfer? So we kind of had that somewhat, identified. And then it was really nice that then we could go through and they could see oh, my questions, they all relate with this.
And in my classroom, I didn't do it on a Padlet. I did it on a bulletin board. And so I would, during the lessons, reference back, okay, so this is, there were a lot of people that had a question about this temperature, and I'd read off a couple of the questions, and they'd see that while they were worded differently, they were getting to the same thing. And I was like, the activity that we're doing today is going to help try and answer some of these questions that you students had.
Mm-hmm. And in the past, we've used different phenomena other than this one, and this one we felt like really allowed kids to ask questions that we could connect to the actual content. So they were asking, what are they made up of? Does the inside matter? Are they hollow? Is there different material? What is the material? And those really nicely linked to specific heat. So then we kind of had this of, hey, you've asked all these things, and it felt like a really natural progression to then go into the content that we wanted. With some previous phenomena that we've done, it didn't feel it felt more forced. I was, hey, you asked this question, and now we're going to do this activity, and it didn't fit as well. So that was kind of a benefit of the Joules. So then we had our question boards, and then Becky used this sheet with her kids. So why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so I wanted them to kind of keep track of their thinking and how their thinking was changing related to the content after the activity. So I made this document and shared it with them, and they made their own document. Our driving question then was that the students had to relate back to was, how do you think this activity related to our Joules? So the first day we did this activity called the equilibrium bomb, and the content and the questions that I pulled out had to go with how does mass and temperature impact what's happening in this situation. And so we did the activity, I had them put the content in, and then this reflection piece over there was how do they think mass and temperature relates back to Julie's, to try to understand Julie's more. And so we did that with a couple of other activities. And these content pieces were what we had talked about. We need kids to ask questions about and try and figure these things out. And then we paired what activity kind of goes with that content piece, and then let them reflect in their learning. And then at the end, and having them come back and answering that driving question kind of a little bit bigger and broader, how do Julie's work, after we had gone through the unit.
And I don't know, it was interesting, I guess, for me. So Becky teaches advanced chemistry, and she did this before I did. And I was looking at some of the explanations that her kids came up with, and I was like, oh my gosh, they're like so good. They had all these detail. They were able to like link these things together so well. And then I found that my kids just struggled a lot. Like the actual the phenomenon of what is happening in the Julies is like pretty complex, like, chemistry content. But it was still interesting because even though they struggled and I had to provide more, like we looked at some models and they, put things into chronological order and whatever else, they had more supports with it. At the end, their explanations weren't as thorough, but I still felt like they were able to explain it better than they started. So I kind of had to be okay with like, they don't have the perfect explanation of how the Julies work, but they still have a better understanding of this than they would have when we started. And I still think that there's like power to that.
Yeah, like they had a bigger, deeper understanding. So they might not have had all that specific content knowledge, but that deep, big understanding is, I think, what we want them to come away with, so that they can relate it to their everyday life and see chemistry, these ideas happening in their life. And that's kind of the power to it, I feel. And for me, it was very interesting because there was a big need to know at the end with kids. Like they needed to know how it worked, and they were not going to let me get away with not explaining to them. And Kaylee had to do a little research to actually figure out how.
I figured out how they work, and I was like really into it. And I actually had kids Googling it in class trying to figure it out, and we couldn't Google the answer, which I think makes it a good phenomenon. But they were able to figure out like, hey, it's made of this material on the inside. Can we learn more about what that is? And it actually like changed phases in the middle when it absorbs energy. And they were really interested in that. So there are lots of pieces to it that I think and I hold their attention in.
I thought it was very interesting because it was a phase matter changed, is that we didn't think about that.
Yeah, we didn't know that when we started.
And so then that was another piece to think about. Oh yeah. Energies in the phase change too, not just the temperature change. So
we felt like it was a good phenomenon that they asked questions that actually related to what we wanted. And that
was a process. It wasn't easy to find this phenomenon. We had to like really unpack the standard and think about what we wanted.
Right. So we hope that this is helpful and that you could maybe steal it and use it in the future. Thanks.
Thank you.